Today we'll be discussing the measures to control inflation. In the previous classes we have discussed the different types of inflation, causes of inflation and effects of inflation. Today let's see on the measures to control inflation. And among the measures to control inflation, here are some of the important measures which I have listed out. Here we have your fiscal policy, monetary policy, selective credit controls, supply management through imports, income policy, freezing wages, raising aggregate supply through fuller utilization of productive capacity. So we'll be looking into these various points thoroughly. We'll try to see how these measures will control inflation within an economy. Firstly, let's see fiscal policy by reducing budget deficit. As we all know that inflation have been caused mainly because of deficit financing. When the economy is not sustainable due to inflation, rising prices, government usually go for deficit financing. So, reducing these budget deficits can be an effective measure for controlling inflation. In the budget, we have two parts, revenue budget and your capital budget. Revenue budget, the receipts are revenue raised through taxes, interest, fees, surpluses from public undertaking, and expenditure side consumption, expenditure by the government on goods and services required to meet the need of defense, civil administration, education, and health, etc. This is the side of revenue budget. Here the receipts of these revenue budgets are those revenues raised through taxes, those interests and fees paid by public or government, and surpluses from public undertaking, whereas your expenditure mainly consists of your expenditure by government on goods and services required to meet the need of defense, civil administration, education, and health. These are one of those important sectors which government can spend, provided the revenue is there. Receipts are obtained within the economy. Then we have capital budget. The receipts are market borrowing by government from banks and other financial institutions, foreign aid, small savings, etc. Here in the capital budget, we have those receipts. The revenues may be from market borrowing by the government from financial institutions, or taking help or foreign aid from other foreign countries, or small savings by the public or the people within the economy. And in the expenditure side, we have the expenditures are defense loans to public enterprises for development purpose, and loan to state and union territories. These are the major expenditures made from capital budget. So, to reduce budget deficit and keep deficit financing within a safe limit, the government can mobilize more resources through taxes, both direct and indirect. Here, fiscal policy being a measure to control inflation and by reducing the budget deficit. To reduce this budget deficit and keep deficit financing within a safe limit, within a controllable limit, so that inflation can be controlled and the government can mobilize resources Government can mobilize resources more through raising taxes. We have government is levying taxes, both direct and indirect. Increase the rate, the level of taxes. Market borrowing. Market borrowings. If more borrowing is done by government, open market systems, then generally as a whole, the availability of money in the hands of the public will become lesser. This will reduce the pressure of inflation, raising small savings, encouraging public provident funds, PFs, or national savings schemes, so that people will start savings. Then we have curtailing wasteful and unessential expenditures. Wasteful and unessential expenditures might not necessarily be wasteful or unessential, but for the situation, for controlling inflation, those expenditures which are likely or which are not that much important which could be curtailed or controlled and kept for the next financial year. So by adjusting these expenditures, budget deficit can be controlled. Then pruning down non-planned expenditures. Non-planned expenditures. The more the expenditure on non-planned activities or projects, the more will be the budget deficit. So pruning down or controlling down or bringing down this non-planned expenditure will help to reduce budget deficit. Then we have by greater resource mobilization. Maybe there can be a scope of better mobilization of resources, better utilization of resources. Especially in our country like India, we have resources. There might be resources which are still untapped. So better or greater mobilization, utilization of our resources also can reduce this budget deficit. Then we have monetary policy. Monetary policy as a measure of controlling inflation by squeezing credit. Monetary policy refers to the adoption of suitable policy regarding interest rate and the availability of credit. It is also an important measure for reducing aggregate demand to control inflation. Now, monetary policy is a suitable policy regarding interest rate and the availability of credit. In order to control the availability of money or money supply within the economy or money in the hands of the public, this solely depends on the interest rate and the availability of credit. If interest rate is less or high, the money in the hands of the public will be more or high. Interest rate if high, people will be interested to keep more savings. And if there is availability of credit, with lower interest rate, there would be absorption of people. People would like to take more credit. So monetary policy, by controlling the interest rate and availability of credit, is an important measure for reducing aggregate demand to control inflation. Monetary policy can work in two ways. First, it can affect the cost of credit, and secondly, it can influence the credit availability for private business firms. Here, the higher the rate of interest rate, the greater the cost of borrowing from banks, even though it is considered to be interest inelastic. Here, we are using the word interest inelastic because in some parts of 1970s and 80s, interest rate doesn't affect the investment. So whether interest rate is high or low, investment always take place. Credit businessmen, entrepreneurs go for loans and carry out their businesses. So interest rate, the greater the rate of interest, the cost of borrowing from banks is also supposed to be higher. So higher rate of interest, the greater will be the cost of borrowing from banks. So higher rate of interest on savings and fixed deposits will induce more savings by the households and help in cutting down aggregate consumption expenditure. So higher rate of interest bringing a higher cost for borrowing, people would not like to borrow at the higher rate of interest. But what will happen, this higher rate of interest will induce people to save more. This more saving, rise or increase in saving by the household will directly affect the expenditure of the households. So more savings will induce in more savings will help in cutting down the aggregate consumption expenditure. The main instruments that monetary authority may employ for controlling the supply of money and credit may include open market sales of securities. Open market sales of securities. These securities are an assurance, bonds, which the people can buy. So when people started buying securities from the government, they are going to deposit more money in the hands of the government. So lesser amount of money cash will be in the hands of the public. Increase in bank rate. Bank rate is the rate at which commercial banks could take loan money from the Central or Reserve Bank of India. So increasing the rate, increasing this bank rate will mean there will be lesser amount in the hands of the commercial banks. Lesser amount of cash with commercial banks will mean their capacity or the availability of money with them will make it possible to give lesser amount of loans to the public. Or also by increasing your cash reserve ratio, CRR is also there. So these are the monetary policies or measures. By increasing CRR, more money will be deposited by commercial banks to the Reserve Bank or Central Bank. So this will limit their availability of cash for loaning and for other business purposes. Increase in statutory reserve requirements. Now, not only by increasing your bank rate or increasing the cash reserve ratio, your statutory reserve requirement is also another means which the commercial banks have to keep with the Central Bank or Reserve Bank of India in the form of securities or other liquid assets. Then we have higher structure of interest on deposits and advances. Better or higher rate of interest, manipulating the interest rate for the public will try to absorb or will bring encouragement to the public for more deposits with the commercial banks or with the banks. Selective credit control. Selective credit controls are meant to regulate the flow of credit for particular or specific purposes. These selective credit controls seek to change the distribution or allocation of credit between its various uses. These selective credit controls are also known as qualitative control. Just before we have mentioned what we have discussed are the quantitative credit controls. Here we have qualitative credit control. Selective credit control are usually meant to regulate the flow of credit for particular or specific purposes. Means credits which banks or commercial banks or central banks are supposed to give out will be controlled in such a manner that the credit given will have a specific purposes, the purpose of which may be for direct development. So, by directing the flow of this credit from based on its importance is your selective credit control. It seeks to change the distribution or allocation of credit between its various uses. So this credit will be given, credit will be diverted or directed based on its various uses. The selective credit control generally used are change in the minimum margin for lending by banks against the stock of specific goods kept or against other types of securities. Change in minimum margin for lending by banks. Banks can change the margin, the amount available with them for credit purposes, for lending, based on the specific goods, kept against or any other types of securities with them. The fixation of maximum limit or ceiling on advances to individual borrowers against stock of particular sensitive commodities. Also, there can be fixation of maximum limit up to what amount or up to what level can an individual borrower borrow against the stock of particular sensitive commodities. Based on this stock of commodities or sensitive commodities available, their limit can be fixed. Then we have the fixation of maximum discriminatory rates of interest chargeable on credit for particular purposes. Now, fixing the interest rate, fixation of maximum discriminatory rate of interest chargeable on credit for particular purpose. When an entrepreneur or a businessman want to proceed for taking credit from a financial institutions, so based on the importance, based on the project or based on the development works which the entrepreneur is supposed to do, this maximum rate of interest can be adjustable or can be fixed. So in India, we have the selective credit controls are being used by Reserve Bank to prevent speculative hoardings of commodities so as to check the rise in price of the commodities. So in India, we have our selective control mostly being used by Reserve Bank in order to prevent hoardings of commodities, goods and commodities. Hoardings means unnecessary hoarding or piling up or stocking of goods and commodities. When there is more hoarding in times of inflation, this leads to a higher rise or a faster pace in the rise of your prices. So to check all these holdings, Reserve Bank uses this selective credit control in order to check the rise in the price of commodities. We have another point, supply management through imports. Supply management through imports. So, in situation of inflation due to rising prices, due to rise in aggregate demand, the output cannot be, supply could not be met. So this, if in one way or the other, there is possibility of increasing the supply or increasing the output within the economy, your aggregate demand can be equalized with your aggregate supply. So, to correct excess demand relative to aggregate supply, the latter can be raised by importing goods in short supply. So, due to rise in aggregate demand or excess demand in certain commodities which are in short supply. In short supply. So these can be met. The shortage of goods or commodities which are in excess demand can also be met by buying from neighboring countries or other countries. At times of inflationary expectation, there is tendency on party of businessmen to hold goods for speculative purposes. Now when these businessmen started seeing or expects a situation of inflation, expects a situation of rising prices, these businessmen started holding up, piling up, stocking up these goods, commodities. So this hoarding, piling up, stocking of goods, commodities will again intensify the pace of rise in price. So the attempt by the government to import goods in short supply would compel the hoarders to release their hoarded stocks. Now, when government started importing those goods or commodities which are being hoarded by the businessmen in order to meet the excess demand requirement of the people within the economy. So these businessmen or hoarded goods will be released automatically. So controlling the rise in price. So the hoarded stocks will be released, will be compelled to be sold within the economy. Now, however, the country can achieve and enlarge this import surplus if it has enough foreign exchange reserve, which can be used to spend on imports, or if sufficient foreign aid is available to import the goods in short supply. Now, importing those goods, those commodities which are in excess demand or in short supply will depend on the availability of the foreign exchange reserve. The reserve which is available with the government, with the financial institutions for payment of your BOPs. So the more the availability of foreign exchange reserve, the more will be the ability of the economy or the country to purchase, to import goods or commodities. If foreign exchange is either less, then also it can depend on foreign aid also. If it has good foreign aid, then this will be managed to import the goods which are in short supply. Then we have income policy, freezing wages. Another anti-inflationary measure is the avoidance of wage increases which are unrelated to improvement in productivity. This requires exercising control over wage income. So, controlling the wage rate or freezing the wages is another anti-inflationary measure. By avoiding the wages increase. So in times of inflation, there usually be, due to rise in price, there usually be demand for increasing the wages. So if these wage increases are to be unproductive, there is no need of increasing the wage rate. So if increase in wages are unrelated to improvement in productivity, this rise in wages, if not favorable for increasing the output within the economy, there is the requirement of exercising control over wage income. Rising wages to meet cost of living in times of inflation may give rise to cost push inflation, and also adding fuel to the fire. Here we are talking about adding fuel to the fire. It is the situation of inflation. So rising wages, if wages are raised to meet the cost of living due to rise in price, this will further increase the availability of cash, money, or supply of money within the economy. This will in turn again push the rate, give a rise in the prices. So cost of labors will be increased. So cost of productivity, production will increase, will rise. This will again become cost push inflation. So this vicious circle of wage chasing prices must be checked. So an important measure will be to control wages. But then we have, however, control of wages with respect to its productivity only will be socially unjust. Now, controlling wages, cutting down wages only with respect to its productivity only will become unjust or socially unjust. So we must look into a broader way or a broader scene. So here, socially unjust will mean that this rise in wages rate will increase the cost of production. So even though if there is a rise in cost of production, if the marginal physical productivity of labor also increases, then this might be manageable. So according to economic theory, the marginal physical productivity of labor will slowly diminish. So since with more employment and with lesser marginal physical productivity and rising wages, the cost of production will keep on increasing, and looking into only the wages part and controlling or cutting down the wages only will be socially unjust. Therefore, adoption of a broader based income policy which would cover not only wages but also profits, interest, and rents will be an effective way to control inflation. So not only looking into the wages or income earned by people, the income through profits, interest, and rents should also be accounted, should also be controlled so that inflation could be controlled. Raising aggregate supply through fuller utilization of productive capacity. Aggregate supply could be enhanced or can be increased by better utilization of productive capacity available within the economy. If the productive capacity in the economy is not fully utilized, then excess demand can also be reduced by adopting measures for utilizing fully the idle productive capacities in various industries of the economy. Now, availability of excess demand causing rise in prices or bringing a situation of inflation. So, this excess demand which cannot be met out with the available supply or available production of output can be looked into from a better or from the productive capacity angle, whether it is fully utilized within the economy or not. If there is scope of enhancing, increasing the productive capacity by better utilizing, by more efficient utilization of resources, then this excess demand can be reduced. So, important measures for utilizing the idle productive capacities which are yet to be used by various industries may be adopted. This would augment the aggregate supply of output and reduce the gap between aggregate demand and output, and will therefore tend to check the inflationary potential. So, by augmenting, by increasing, by enhancing the aggregate supply of output, the gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply would be bridged, would be adjusted. So, when your aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal or in equilibrium, then these will check the inflationary potential within the economy. So, to conclude, it is thus clear that the adoption of various monetary, fiscal and other policy measures, the aggregate demand can be reduced on the one hand and the aggregate supply of output can be increased on the other. These would help in bridging the gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which would enable us to contain the inflationary pressures in the economy. So, from the above discussion, we have seen that implementations or use of monetary, fiscal and other policy measures can reduce the excess demand available within the economy in the one hand, and also increase the production, increase the output, increase the supply of goods and commodities on the other. So, when aggregate supply, aggregate demand are in equilibrium, the gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply would be diminished, would be suppressed, so that the inflationary pressures within the economy would be contained. Thank you.